All right, guys. Hey, so it's been a minute since I talked to you. I've been summer vacation and all that. I was going through some notes recently, preparing for a class, and I thought maybe I would just kind of go through these notes with you a little bit. So forgive me if this is a little disjointed, but here, look, there's this question about what constitutes the Shen and what this is, and one thing that I heard that kind of cleared this up for me was that there's a difference between, and I think this is a Jeffrey Ewan thing, but a difference between what's considered sort of the little Shen, sort of very specific to the heart, and then the big Shen, which is kind of all five elements put together. So that at least provides some framework for understanding sort of the difference between what constitutes just sort of a heart thing, which has to do with a basic zest for life, um, a vivaciousness about life, right? These kinds of things, or on the other side of it, sort of anxiety and these kinds of things. So versus like a large Shen thing, which is sort of everything sort of operating together, all sort of five of the elements there. So, but one thing that brings up to me that's kind of interesting, which is the notion of, normally we're thinking about each of the elements in terms of their negative emotion, so it's sort of a diagnostic, right? So we're saying for the liver, then we're saying, look, like this has to do with anger and frustration, all these things. But then what's on the flip side of that? Right. And so some of the words that you get are like one of them, a very common one is like kindness. When liver people are healthy, they're very kind, like helpful. They want to be helpful. And that's kind of the specific thing. And they're helpful to the point of wishing to engage in problem solving behavior with you. So if you have a problem and you go to a spleen person, they're just going to give you a hug and, just, okay, let's just relax. And, but you go to a liver person, yeah, you're going to get more of a, okay, well, what are we doing? And so there's kindness there. But it's more in a way that's like helpful with a problem solving vibe, right? Okay, virtuous is another one. So operating within the confines of a accepted cultural milieu and acting virtuous in the context of that culture. So whatever the values of that culture are, then it's operating at the best quality given that culture, right? So, following the basic structures of how people are meant to interact with each other in a way that is virtuous, in a way that, like this. So this is the hun, right? So the ability to interact with others, to gauge. It's the skill with which we interact, right? This is how we say the hun works. It's the skillfulness of interaction. Well, this then gets translated to in a larger way, on a macrocosmic way, sort of how you operate vis-a-vis the whole culture that you're embedded in, not just how you deal with individuals. So on the two sides, and interesting, on the other side with the liver, you get anger and frustration, all these things. But then you get words like killing is actually one that you see used in the West, like a translation, so to speak, of this flip side of the liver, killing. And it is interesting that the way that we think of anger, in a way, if you think of what anger is useful for, in a somewhat restricted way, anger is useful for killing something in the sense of like a relationship, right? So you've probably all been in this situation where you're in a bad relationship and you're working on yourself, and you're sort of confused about what's going on, until at some point the truth dawns on you that you're being oppressed in that situation, and then you get angry, and it's the anger, in a sense, that kind of shows you the truth to some degree and is caused by the truth, but the anger gives you the power to move on that truth, to sort of make a decision, the courage to make a decision, right? Gallbladder. So in that sense, killing that relationship, it's not until you have the anger that you sort of have the strength and the courage to get out of something and kill that relationship. You see this is true too in, I do a lot of pediatrics, so this gets to be true in child rearing, where, I'm often encouraging parents, you have to provide boundaries, you have to provide discipline, but you never do either of those things when you're angry, because the anger separates you from the child. It kills the bond. It breaks the bond between you and the child, and that's rarely a good thing with children. So there are obviously ways to parent that don't involve just letting them do whatever they want. But this notion that you don't want to create that separation from your child, so just don't parent when you're angry, tap out, tag out, let the other person jump in, or just, take it easy for a second. So killing, this word gets used. But I mean, of course, this could be in a more physical sense, right? But so liver. So this notion, anyways, of there being sort of a flip side to this. Giovanni has an interesting way of talking about the Shen generally. So he sort of had these definitions of the Shen, and in typical Giovanni fashion, he doesn't provide necessarily his Chinese and the translations and all these things. You got to kind of digging for these things. So I sat with him through some, things, mental emotional disorders and personality disorders and things. But he just had this general way of thinking about it. And whether it's true or not, I think it is a nice way. It's a nice framework here, because normally when we think about the Shen, we just say, oh, Shen disturbed, right? Shen unsettled. And then we just sort of land on that, and we're not sure what to do with that. So he had a thing which was interesting, which was the first framework, the first piece of this framework would be something that he called the Shen being weakened. And this is like depression. Okay, so in this case, the Shen being weakened, and because depression, by sort of almost by definition from a Chinese medical standpoint, is in a sense a lack of realistic thinking about your situation. Let's just sort of frame it that way for a second. But what's interesting here is that in Chinese medicine, the notion is that the part of your body that provides this realistic thinking is the intellect, the yi, the aspect of the Shen related to the spleen. Intelligence and intellect is actually, in a sense, what provides clear thinking about reality, right? And so depression by nature, the person is suffering. Otherwise, we wouldn't sort of pathologize it that way. So the fact that the person is suffering indicates pathology. So then we say, okay, there is a problem as defined by this person's experience. And so, but this isn't Shen obstruction. This isn't, disturbed Shen. But something's going on with the Shen. So I like this because the Shen weakened is a nice way to frame the notion that for some reason the spleen, the clear yang of the spleen, is failing to rise into the mind to create clear thinking. Right, so we're used to saying, oh, all depression is liver qi stagnation. Yes, it's possible that liver qi stagnation is there, but it so commonly is, right? But by definition, in a sense, if you take a step back, you would say, well, if the spleen is what the clear yang of the spleen rises into the mind to create clear thinking about reality, about your reality and your situation, then what is blocking that? Okay. So then, of course, the myriad diagnostics that come out, just come spilling out of the woodwork here, yang deficiency, qi deficiency, but then you get qi stagnation, can block that upward movement. Okay, fine. This is Shen weakened. The next one he had was Shen unsettled, and this was more things like anxiety or insomnia. Again, this is not Shen obstruction or Shen disturbance. This is just the Shen is unsettled. So rather than being weak and sort of the Shen is almost lacking, like in Shen weakened is like the Shen lacks presence. The person doesn't show up, right? Now, I'm sure you guys are thinking of a number of examples of this, right? Just depression just being one of them. Well, Shen unsettled then is sort of, in a sense, the opposite of that. The Shen is present, but it's this nervous energy. It's being sort of, in a sense, harassed by something. So it's unsettled, and then, of course, we know the reasons for this: heat and deficiency and blah, 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 so, but anxiety having its numerous causes, insomnia also having its numerous causes. So the Shen unsettled, because for those of you who have experienced anxiety, it's a very unsettled experience. It's a very unpleasant physical experience, and it's variously described, but it can be like a kind of a like an intense sort of buzzing in the chest, and it's just driving your thought process, and it's hard to shut that off. And same problem at night with insomnia. You don't even need to be anxious. It just, your thoughts are just running. You just can't fall asleep. You got restless legs and all of these things, right? So this is the Shen is kind of buzzing, vibrating, bzz, 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 Shen unsettled. So I think this is a nice thing. Now, then the third one, the last one, is you get to the Shen obstruction. Shen disturbance. Now we're talking about schizophrenia, bipolar. This is obviously a much worse sort of situation, and this is where you get the very extreme aspects of personality pathologies coming out. Shen obstruction. This is where you start to think about phlegm and the like, right? So one of the things that I was thinking about that kind of made me want to jump on this thing was, you get ADHD, right? So of course, treat a lot of kids, right? So I get a lot of parents coming in, bringing their kids in with diagnoses of ADHD. And ADHD, of course, has the hyperactive type, it has the inattentive type, and then it has the mixed type. But for today's purposes, let's just focus on the so-called hyperactive type. And there's actually two hyperactive types, but we're just going to focus on the liver type, just for fun. For those of you who have sat with me in classes and stuff, you just have to listen again. I'm sorry. And now that I'm thinking about it, for those of you who want to organize something, I'd be happy to come and teach for you, whether online. I very much prefer in person, but I'm willing to travel. I have a suitcase. I'm willing to travel. So anyways, this liver type ADHD, this is what we consider sort of the excess type, the liver qi stagnation, and then varying degrees of liver heat. And it creates a certain circumstance for a child in which they have behavior that the school deems not reasonable for learning, right? So there's this thing. And they can often have a combination of two things, which is vexation and then agitation. Right? So we hear these words get used, vexation and agitation. As a general rule, vexation refers to the mental aspect of all of this, and agitation refers to the physical aspect of all of this. So insomnia almost kind of falls into this, right? So if you're up in the middle of the night, you can't fall asleep because your brain is just on fire. You're just thinking. That's like the vexation is the mental part. And then the agitation is the part of you that's just restless, just tossing around in bed and you're just flipping around, your legs are kicking and stuff. So then that's the physical side. So vexation being the mental side, agitation being the physical side. Well, in ADHD, in this hyperactive type, this is very much what's going on here for these kids in this liver excess type. Okay. Now, let me at the outset say something that occurred to me a number of years ago that I've still held to in treating these kids, which is that, in fact, it's not the hyperactivity in a sense that bothers me here. I'm not necessarily bugged when a kid has a lot of energy and they're jumping out of their chairs and they're having trouble, sort of focusing. I mean, to some degree, a kid should be able to focus, but the thing is like the school systems are more geared towards sort of audio-visual learning, which does require a certain amount of sitting, more sitting than not. And, schools actually, I'll give them credit, have gotten better over the years at this, more group work, more, sort of up out of your seat work and stuff, but still, kids are sitting doing worksheets for, hours on end and, sometimes not so many breaks. Like I said, schools are getting better about it, or at least paying lip service to the idea of getting better about this. But it's hard for certain kids, especially these woody type kids who are just sort of born woody. They have a lot of energy. They're very inquisitive, and they're kind of hands-on kids. What we would call sort of kinesthetic type learners. And so these kids want to learn by doing stuff. They'll learn math. Dude, these kids are some of the smartest kids in the school, but they just learn differently. They learn in context is what their preference is. So let's learn math and angles while building a fort. Teach me geometry because that's what's required to build a fort. Learn how to use a protractor, right? So it's simple things like this. This is what these kids need, but the system isn't really set up for that. And who's to blame? But whatever. It's hard to build a school system that's going to cater to everybody, and that's fairly resource intensive. I mean, a whole nation full of fort building schools. I mean, a man can dream, but this is tough, right? So these kids end up in a situation where their basic nature is getting a little squashed. The parents sort of feel like, my kid's a little bit, it's kind of nutty and running around a lot and getting into trouble and touching other people's stuff and just kind of like just making a nuisance out of themselves from the perspective of a parent or a school, administration or something. So the kid gets a little squashed. And what we say in Chinese medicine is that boundaries are good. They actually the liver loves boundaries. I mean, you take any liver type person and they just love making boundaries. It's one of their favorite things to do. And enforcing them on others, this is classic, any lawmaker has to be liver type by definition almost. So, but they require boundaries for themselves. But the thing is the way you enforce the boundaries really is a strong risk factor for how they're going to turn out, in a sense. Like, so too many boundaries leads to liver qi stagnation. That's what we say. So what we mean by too many boundaries is when the discipline is perceived by the child to be hard. There's too many expectations. The parents are breathing down the kid's neck, and then it just tightens around them. Their situation just gets really tight. And so then that stagnates their qi. All right? So all that discipline to get them to behave quote unquote correctly. So that liver qi stagnation then ultimately, leads to heat over a certain amount of time. I mean, these are woody kids, so they're just one step from fire, so the heat is coming, right? So then you get a series of symptoms. Impulsivity. They're blurting out answers and can't wait their turn and intruding on conversations and space and games and whatever. They fidget in the seat and whatever. They can't stay seated. They run around and climb excessively and have trouble doing things quietly. And they're just sort of like talking a lot. They're almost like driven by a motor. Like, I'll get these kids coming into my clinic and they're just going through all my stuff. There's no bad boundaries. They're just opening drawers that they shouldn't be opening and just pulling things out that have nothing to do with them. Fine, but you know what I mean? It's a bit much. So another part of this liver qi stagnation is that they make sort of provoking relationships with others, with other kids or even with adults and stuff like that. And all of this stuff, I mean, the symptom list goes on and on and on, of course, but I started this conversation saying, look, I'm not that concerned with the hyperactivity, even the impulsivity to some degree. I'm like, it's just, these kids are just naturally curious and they're intelligent. This kid needs an outlet. This is natural curiosity that just needs an outlet. So I got some kid tearing my room apart. I don't like it, but I understand it. I can empathize with it. But where I start to have a problem is when the child is themselves suffering. But how do we judge this? I judge it through the lens of anger, frustration issues, irritability, emotional lability, emotional sensitivity, all of these things. That, to me, is the indication that the child themselves is not happy. When they really are making provoking relationships, combative relationships with other people, whether in the house, out of the house, wherever it is, when it's to an excess, it's some indication to me that the child is not happy, right? They're very emotionally sensitive. Little things lead to big blowouts, big emotions, and then they have trouble settling down and all of these things. This to me is sort of this, in some way, Shen unsettled, So this is how I draw the line. High energy, hyperactive kid, cool. Angry, frustrated, irritable kid, nah, this is not ideal, right? So there's a million things to talk about here from a Chinese medicine perspective, points and formulas and this is all pretty obvious. What's interesting to me here, though, is not so much the treatment aspect of this, which it's more the conceptual aspects of this, right? So I think a podcast format the conceptual aspects is actually what's interesting here. And this notion of too much discipline leading to liver qi stagnation, then leading to liver heat and fire, right? So the worse the behavior is, the more liver qi stagnation there is, the more fire and heat and fire there is here. Right? So this is then what I'm thinking about in this situation. Okay, so fine, treat the kid. This is all these things. But then we were talking a while back, a couple of episodes back, about the nature of insubstantial phlegm. So phlegm comes into play here. Last time we talked about, phlegm is present when the situation, when there starts to be delusion, right? When just something that just obviously isn't true, at least in the larger accepted, reality that we live in, then we start pointing to phlegm as a thing. It's the indicator. Delusion is the indicator that phlegm is present, right? One small proviso to that is that sometimes phlegm can be small enough, or in a small enough amount, that rather than creating delusional behavior, it just intensifies the behavior. So what'll happen is the behavior will be quite extreme. Just the kid is just oppositional defiance, to the max, right? And it could be phlegm. One example of this we had, I remember when I was with my old mentor, and we went into the room, and the kid was basically, I got to follow my mentor, and I got to go into the room with him during diagnostics and stuff. And so we walk into a room, and the kid, this like 8 or 9 year old boy is like screaming at his father, just screaming at him. Actually, he was screaming, "I'm going to kill you." Speaking of killing. So this was right off the bat, you're thinking to yourself like, yeah, this is easy, right? So you go in thinking liver, everything confirms that this is a liver excess case. And so treat him as such. Treatment went on for 2 or 3 weeks, zero change, just wasn't getting on top of it. Well, then it turned out, after some more questioning, that the child was actually drinking a gallon of milk a day. Yes, yes, your shocked expression is warranted. A gallon of milk a day, which is, but he liked milk, so, So then my teacher switches up the treatment to clearing some, phlegm out of the digestive system, opening up the digestive system, strengthening the spleen, but really just opening the digestive to release this issue. And the notion being that excess milk consumption was probably leading to one of two things, but maybe to some Yangming heat that was sort of potentiating the liver heat or adding to the liver heat, but more likely leading to quite a bit of phlegm, like sort of insubstantial phlegm. Sort of just the insubstantial phlegm almost acts as like a wet blanket or something. It just, that the presence of this almost kind of physical substance, this physical non-physical substance, really acts as an obstruction to the qi movement, and so then just intensifies the symptoms. And the minute he went off that milk, the dad came back the next week, and his kid was like almost back to normal. Like it was a night and day difference. Right. So my teacher then explains this whole concept to me. Of course, this is how I learned this stuff, right? So on the one hand, then this presence of insubstantial phlegm makes the situation seem more extreme, or is more extreme. And then I start to wonder in adults the degree to which then, especially for liver types, but also, for spleen types, where dampness and phlegm acts as this obstructive factor. So in liver types, this obstruction then leads to more liver qi stagnation. It just makes their situation that much harder. And maybe they're getting attracted to sweets and fatty foods and stuff because of an inherent blood deficiency underneath the surface, which, of course, if you had enough blood, you couldn't get liver qi stagnation because the blood would emoliate all that movement, and you would just always feel fine because you get blood coming out of your ears in a figurative sense that way. But as you age, or due to constitution, you don't have enough blood, it doesn't emoliate the liver, it doesn't lubricate the liver. So the less blood you have, it's easier and easier and easier for you to get liver qi stagnation. So in a case where you do have blood deficiency, I think your body goes after sugars as a way not only to build up spleen deficiency. I actually think sugar craving is more a question of blood deficiency as much as it is maybe as qi deficiency. Your body is just trying to build fluids. And then that dampness then becomes an obstruction to the qi dynamic, and then liver qi people just get more liver qi, right? And then how this affects a spleen person, how this is going to affect a lung person when that phlegm's getting in the lungs and that's covering the spleen, and it starts affecting the heart. This is no good. This is the worst, right? Even the kidneys, so how these things all play out in the 5 phases, we could have a further conversation later, but right now, just the liver, it's an obstruction to the liver, and I think this is the case both in children and in adults. Okay, I'm just giving you the child example because that's who I treat, but I think it goes both ways. Okay. Now, we did say 2 times ago that that insubstantial phlegm then does lead to some kind of delusional behavior. My old mentor, the same old guy, he said something. He goes, look, I know this isn't the responsible word, but the presence of phlegm is often betrayed when the situation just gets a little weird. And he goes, I know it's not the responsible word for this, but it's just the word that comes to mind. So when you see it, you'll know. The situation just gets a little weird. Oh, okay. So I just pack that away in my brain and wait for it to come up. Okay, I had a kid come in. This actually, the way that this starts is I had a patient of mine, this young girl, and I had treated her for a while, and it was fantastic results, and the mom was kind of over the moon about it. Well, it turned out she was a therapist, a psychologist specializing in art therapy for children, and she went on maternity leave, and she left her patients to a colleague of hers. But part of the maternity leave was she sent me a kind of a handful of some of her patients, and I got the feeling that she sent me some of the more difficult ones because she thought I could help or something. Well, they were all in their own way quite extreme, and difficult cases and mixed results, I would say, especially when there's a lot of medications involved. So it just makes those things harder, as you know. But one of them was very indicative to me of this phlegm question. So he was a classic liver type. I mean, he had all the things we just talked about: the anger, the frustration, the fidgeting, and all of these things. And so, so I'm just having this conversation with the mom, who was a bit odd herself, but we're having this conversation, we're unpacking this stuff. The first thing that starts to occur is that he starts he's sitting on the treatment table, and he's like whining and kind of squirming and shutting his eyes and squinching his face up, and mom's like, honey, I have to talk about this, we're here to talk about it. I'm like, oh, she's like, he doesn't like it when I talk about him in front of people, and he's so this kind of like anxiety is coming out in a way, which is an indication to me that the liver pathology is spilling out into the heart, right? So some of that heat's getting into the heart. Maybe there's some pre-existing heart deficiency or something, the normal stuff. But that sort of anxiety sort of reaction to me indicates that the heart is involved. Okay, so I'm starting to build my diagnostic here. There's insomnia, there's all these things. Well, okay, so we start to talk, and we're kind of unpacking the insomnia part of it. And she said, oh, yeah, he is having trouble sleeping. He says that the house is kind of noisy, and so it's hard for him to fall asleep and hard for him to stay asleep because the house is noisy. I was like, oh, okay, well, is the house noisy? And she goes, no, not that I've ever heard, but he says the house creaks and stuff. So there's these random creaking noises in the house that kind of just keep him up. I'm like, oh, okay. And it all seems pretty reasonable. And then she said, yeah, and sometimes like he'll even fall out of the bed. And I'm like, oh, okay, like he's falling asleep and falling out of the bed or something. He's an active sleeper, which would be a very typical sign for liver, right? So people who are active sleepers, that sleep talking, sleepwalking, tossing and turning, and the kids doing the calisthenics in bed and the kicking off the blankets. It's all this liver stuff, right? Well, she says, yeah, he is an active sleeper, but no, this is actually, he falls out of bed when he's awake, actually, because he says that the house is tilting. Okay. Is there some kind of foundation issue? Is the house tilting? She says, no, the house isn't tilting. And then, so now my antenna goes up a little bit. The radar bleeps a bit. And I'm like, okay, so can you kind of tell me about that? What do you mean the house is tilting? It's just something he says. The house is tilting. And sometimes he just falls out of bed because the house is tilting enough that he loses his balance in bed. Okay. All right. So then we're kind of I'm like, okay, where do we go from here? Okay. So we're trying to unpack the sleep a little more. I actually just let it lie. I was like, okay, let's just get on with treatment. He was a difficult kid to treat. He didn't want me touching him, all these things. Okay. They come back the next week. How are things going? I don't know. So I'm like, all right, well, tell me a little bit more about the insomnia. He's having a little trouble falling asleep because the house is a little loud and it's kind of disturbing him. There's these things that are kind of disturbing him. What else is going on at night? Okay, so she says, well, she says he also says, and she's hesitating. She says he says he hears people talking. Like, oh, okay. Is there somebody? Do you have neighbors that are close by? Do you live in an apartment or something? No. Nobody's close, and there's nobody around talking. I certainly don't hear anything. And I'm like, oh, okay, people are talking. Look, remember I told you that the mom was a little odd. I know it's not the responsible word here, but she's sort of she's sort of slowly unpacking this and like not just kind of coming out with it. And so I was like, okay, so the voices, all right, anything else disturbing? And she says, well, he has me the last couple months he's had me taping trash bags up over the air conditioners because that's over the air conditioning vents in his room because that's where the voices are coming from. Okay, now, so then she says, oh, and also the eyes that watch him come out of there and then they hover in the room and watch him. And I'm like, oh, all right, wait, hold on. So I'm like, hold on, let me step out. Will you step out with me for a second? So we step out in the hallway and I'm like, hey, I have to say, this kind of sounds like some kind of, almost like a paranoid schizophrenia. And mind you, this kid is like, I didn't say, he's like 9 or 10 or something like that, pretty young. And she says, oh, yeah, that's what the psychiatrist says. Of course, remember, this kid was referred to me from an old patient of mine, and she didn't prepare me for any of this. So I walked in blind, and she says, yeah, that's what the psychiatrist says. So now this kid basically has a presumptive diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia because of audio hallucinations, visual hallucinations. And it goes further down the rabbit hole a bit here, that there's this storyline that's happening in his mind about people and around and talking about him. And, so right, we talked about this hyper connection that's occurring in the heart. Everything's about you, right? So I'm like, oh, okay, I got it. So we're working together for a while, and I wish this story had a better ending. Really, results were quite mixed. I wasn't super convinced that we were getting good results. Treatments were inconsistent. The herb taking was certainly not consistent. It wasn't really happening at all. So, and then they just stopped coming. I never really got to follow. I did call them a year later. I just was so curious. I just cold called them a year later and was like, "Hey, I thought I felt like we were making some decent headway here, and just checking in on you guys. If you ever need anything, I'm still around." And the mom says, "Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, everything's fine now. Everything's been fine." Okay, well, if everything's ever not fine, then just by all means, please, I'm still around, and I'd love to hear from you guys. Okay, thank you. And that was the end of it. So I'm sorry to disappoint you that I don't have the ending, but I'm also disappointed I don't have the ending to this story. So I don't know how that kid turned out. But this, to me, was kind of a quintessential example of, as my teacher said, the pathology getting a little weird on you. This is not the responsible word, but this is what it was in a sense. Right, so this would be an indicator of insubstantial phlegm. Right, this would be a very good example of that. What else is there? Usually when I tell that story, I end up telling another story, and I might as well just tell it. So years and years and years ago, I read a magazine article about kids with a presumptive diagnosis of psychopathy. So little psychopath kids, basically, who had a presumptive diagnosis, right? So the reason that the paranoid schizophrenic kid had a presumptive diagnosis was because if the psychiatrist made a diagnosis, then he was required to write a script for it, and the mother would be required to give it, right? So these things, if you didn't do it, it would sort of be against the law. In theory. So the doctor's preference was to say, look, let's see how things go, get therapy, you could try some, other things, and let's see how it goes. Maybe he'll just outgrow this. Maybe it's just a phase or something. Maybe, all these little things. And, so I don't know. But now I'm reading an article in some magazine somewhere about a journalist who follows a group of kids who all have this presumptive diagnosis of psychopathy. So 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, whatever. And this is basically like pretty classic liver behavior, lying, manipulation, all these kinds of things. But then you add on top of that a certain kind of coldness, a certain kind of calculation, a lack of emotional content, no remorse to their actions, these kinds of things, right? That would be a more classic indicator of psychopathy. And in particular, he follows this one kid who does have this presumptive diagnosis. And the kid, when they were talking about him, is classic liver kid. I mean, frustrated, angry and stuff. But then there's this element to his personality where he just can be violent, but his violence is kind of cold and calculated. He'll stab another kid with a pencil when they're not looking, and it almost has this plausible deniability. He'll be like, "Oh, I don't know what happened. She fell down the stairs. I didn't. I don't know." And it's like, as a parent, you just know when your kid's kind of lying, so it just gets to be this thing. So he had stabbed some kid with a pencil, this and that. So the anger, the frustration, the violence, the manipulation, the lying, it's all this, a lot of it is kind of this cold, calculated stuff. But then there also be these elements of kind of outbursts and anger issues and all that stuff. Okay. So this journalist ends up following this kid to a camp that had been put together for these kids who have this presumptive diagnosis of psychopathy. And of course, the first thing that occurred to me was like, that's a hell of a thing to do, to put all those kids together in one place. But here he is at this camp, and I'm giving you the truncated version of this, but basically the story ends up with the kid being hauled off by security because he had done something to some other kid at the bidding of some girl. So there was a girl at the camp who was basically doling out attention if these boys would do stuff, and she told him to hurt another boy, and there you go. And so he's getting hauled off by security, kicking and screaming her name. It is something that's so this is this notion of this presumptive psychopathy. So I read this story and I'm thinking like, this is pretty crazy. This is kind of wild stuff. So never thinking I would see a kid like that. But then I had a case in my clinic this a while back, and what it was like a middle school age kid, and his stepmom brings him in. So the situation, and I used to live by a military base, so this was a military family, and what had happened is this woman had met a man, and he had a child from a previous marriage, and that was this kid, this 12-year-old. Well, they end up getting married, and they have their own kid now. So there's two kids and the two parents, and then the dad goes off on deployment. So a very common situation, right? So the mom is still there in San Diego area, and dad is gone, and now she's home with her daughter, her biological daughter, who is like 3 years old, and then her non-biological stepson, who is like 12. Okay. The kid was already a livery type before that all went down, but after the dad left, this is all kind of ramping up. His livery behavior, his oppositional behavior, his, anger issues, his frustration, his, just all these things are increasing after the dad leaves. But then it kind of escalates into then the 3-year-old is starting to have accidents. The thing like, I don't know how she fell down the stairs, and I don't know how she got hurt. And the mom, it's like when kids lie, they're terrible at it. You just know something's off, right? So she's starting to be like, nah, this is not good. So now she's starting to kind of panic. It's like, this isn't my kid, and he's hurting my kid, and so she's in a bind, and she's talking to the father via whatever it is at the time. and he's deployed somewhere, and he's saying like, I don't believe it. You must be misunderstanding what's going on here, because he's just not that kind of kid. The dad's not there. He's defending his kid, of course. And so now she's kind of up a creek because he's not providing any material help. I mean, I don't know what he could do, but she doesn't have any relatives. The husband's relatives don't live there. They're living away from their normal home, some other state. She has no help. She is by herself here. And she's got a kid who she thinks is hurting the little one and is lying about it, right? And she's got no help. So then she comes in to see me and she brings this kid in. So it's a very concerning situation. I mean, I can admit that there was some very small part of me that was like, oh, this might be my first psychopath kid. But, it's serious. So basically, I diagnosed it as this sort of presumptive psychopathy sort of situation. But the question becomes, what's the diagnosis in Chinese medicine? We're not used to thinking about it this way. We're not used to thinking about liver excess becoming liver heat, so the yang moves outwards. At least in boys, that yang tends to move outwards. In girls, the yang tends to move inwards. So in boys, when they have liver qi stagnation and liver heat, that heat tends to move outwards. They kind of hate the world. They blame the world. But more often in girls, it's more of a yin response. They actually turn that heat inwards, and they kind of hate themselves. They blame themselves. And that's where you start to get into cutting and stuff like that. So that's why cutting is so often more a girl's kind of behavior, because they're turning that inwards on themselves. And the cutting is a type of stimulus designed to move their qi. In a way, I mean, this gets into, as we talked about before and a long time ago, my notions about what constitutes liver qi stagnation, and the notion of creating movement for yourself to move your qi, whether it's smoking pot, drinking alcohol, running, jogging, cutting yourself, jumping out of airplanes, staring at your phone or starting fights or whatever. It's all just an attempt to move stagnant qi in some very narrow sense. You could just view the world through that lens. Okay. Boys will tend to move that outwards, go shoot up a school or something like, so maybe it's a very extreme example, but this is kind of the thing. So we're used to thinking about liver qi stagnation, liver heat, then going and affecting the heart and leading to heart Shen unsettled issues, right? So it just turns into more, so it just gets worse and worse and worse, but it always just scales up in terms of emotionality. Things just bigger blowouts and more anger-ish, just furious, and, everything's a freak out, and they're throwing their hands in the air, and I'm like, you guys can't see me, but I'm wildly gesticulating, just all of this excess coming out of the liver and getting into the heart and all this stuff, and it's just too much of everything. But instead, here with the psychopathy, we're talking about it's more cool. It's more calm and collected. The anger is more controlled. In psychopathy, certainly they have their moments where it breaks out in a much more typical way, like I was just describing. But psychopathy is unique in the sense that there's a measure of self-control where they can sort of engage in delayed gratification. They can take their time to exact revenge kind of thing, which is not what we sort of think about with the liver. It's usually just instant gratification on that level. Well, here it's different. So what's the difference here? This becomes the question. Is it strong metal? Do these people have very strong metal? I suspect that this is the case to some degree. You watch interviews with confirmed psychopaths. There's something to me that just speaks to metal, the way they hold themselves, the way they coif their hair. There's an element of control there, which always to me speaks to metal, that sort of self-control, right? So my suspicion in a lot of ways is that this is really a strong metal question. And metal can subsume emotions. There's a coolness to metal, remember. Metal is a cool element. It's a yin element. It gets hot, but not easily in a certain sense. It takes time for that to warm up and to boil, so to speak. You don't just melt metal. It takes a time for that to bringing metal to a boil is not so easy. Not like fire. It's already on fire. So this is my suspicion. So Can phlegm play a role in this? Maybe. Insubstantial phlegm, maybe it to some degree obstructs the qi and just creates the more extreme nature of this. Maybe to some degree it's getting into the lungs and obstructing the lungs in some way so that the self view is not there, so to speak. I mean, the thing about lungs is that people with a strong metal element, there is a selfishness to their personality. You really deal with people with a very strong metal element, they can be healthy and they're still pretty self-focused because they need to take care of themselves for various reasons, metal being metal. It's not the strongest constitution, so they're very sensitive. Metal is like their antenna. They're sensitive to everything, physically, energetically, all this stuff, so they need to protect themselves. So it breeds a certain amount of self-interest. But when they're not healthy, it breeds a certain amount of selfishness. Like I used to have an old colleague of mine who would constantly ask me for treatments, very metal type, constantly asking for treatments and never really reciprocating in any real way. Right? It was just all about that person and what that person needed in that moment. And, it was sort of paying mild lip service to the idea that there would be payment or some kind of, exchange of services or something, but not really. So this selfishness. So I think you add liver element stuff to this metal element stuff, and you get these two extremes: the extreme nature of wood and its outbursts, but then mixed with this extreme kind of selfishness. You should think about narcissists and these kinds of things. So I realize this is a shift in focus. We're not really talking about phlegm at this point. It was just more like an interesting story, fleshing out what constitutes a liver type situation. But yeah. Anyways, I think that might be all that I'm thinking about. Anyways, take it easy, guys. It was a long one today. Let's talk soon. Okay, bye.